roadmap Q&A. Before we dive into the Q&A, which is going to be really the entirety of what we're doing this evening, some brief intros. So Justin, could you please just introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, it's great to be here again, and I appreciate everybody coming on. So, just really briefly about myself, I played college baseball at UW Eau Claire, University of Wisconsin Eau Claire. Had a great experience there. I'm the founder of Elite Sports Advising, which is a very well-known recruiting advising service that handles a lot of elite recruits across the U.S. and Canada. Um, I actually sold that company now, but owned that until 2022. I am the founder and current owner of Baseball Recruiting Confidential, and I have a podcast, Baseball Recruiting Confidential podcast. In the last 4 years, I've been the strategic advisor to scouting for the Milwaukee Brewers, so have been heavily involved in the draft evaluation, helping with draft decisions. That's been an incredible experience, and have really enjoyed that. And just I've worked with a lot of different players at a high level, and so I've been in this. I've been at this for a while, and have worked with some really cool players, and actually some guys who are now in the big leagues. And so I know that this is baseball and softball, but it's cool to see some guys performing at a high level like Michael Bush, who hit a walk-off homer the other night. So I've been at it for a while, but really appreciate everybody coming on tonight, and look forward to answering questions and going through stuff.
Awesome. Yeah. And Justin, thank you for sharing your experience tonight. I mean, obviously, just looking at these bullets, a lot of experience on the recruiting front, on the advising front, and also obviously on that player eval front. So thank you for taking some time out of your evening.
Yeah, you
And
bet.
I am Max McKenna. I played college baseball at Amherst College up here in Massachusetts. I've worked at Headfirst full time for 8 or so years, just over 8 years, after interning in college over a summer. Connected through a teammate of mine at Amherst and kind of stuck around. After college, immediately I went into coaching and teaching. So I was a teaching fellow in history and assistant baseball coach at Phillips Andover up here in Massachusetts, and then was a history instructor and head baseball coach at the Masters School outside New York City before coming back to Headfirst full time in 2014, where I've been circling that kind of as a satellite ever since. And a big part of what I've done in my time at Headfirst is really talk with families coming through our showcases, talk with coaches to get those insights, and really kind of build some content, build some information around how to help families and student athletes navigate this recruiting process because it's tough. And so I want to make sure that we're getting that info out there. Now, to make this as kind of smooth as possible and also to have it be really feel organic and like the conversation that it is, I'm going to stop sharing now. There's no slides, there's no bullet points. This is all just going to be an organic conversation back and forth between Justin and I. So, with that being said, would love to see some questions start coming in. So feel free to fire those into the questions tab. As we get going, I'm going to start with some of the questions that we received beforehand, though, as well, so we can just kind of keep it going. First one, pretty natural one, Justin. I'm going to kick to you first. What is the best way to get exposure? How do I get in front of these schools that I'm looking to play for?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously pretty open, right? I mean, but ultimately you're going to boil it down to games, prospect camps, showcases, events like Head First, and you're going to want to strategize when you do that and how you do that, right? Because I think there's a misperception that the more you play, the more tournaments you do, the more exposure that is, and that's not necessarily the case. So you really want to be strategic about where you're going, what you're doing. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, if it when it boils down to it, it really becomes about camps, showcases, and games, and coaches being able to see you in those, whether it's baseball or softball. It really is the same thing for both. I mean, that's where they're going to see you. One avenue that I think, Max, that's become really, I mean, a major catalyst in this is the showcase circuit. I mean, if you're not doing some things from a showcase standpoint, you're probably it's going to be a lot tougher to get that exposure. And I think Headfirst has done a really good job. And there might be prospect camps on campuses, right? That can be really good. But those would be if I had to break it down, those are kind of my simple approaches to getting that exposure.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, and I think that that's to some degree kind of the reason that Head First exists, right? Is to
Yeah,
provide
right,
efficiency in the recruiting process. Because if you go to some of these big tournaments, they're a really good way for coaches to see you play in a competitive atmosphere, right? That's an important piece of it. What does a coach think when they see you in the dugout with a team that you play with all the time, that you really care about the outcome of the game? Like, what's your competitive spirit? What's your level at in that kind of live tournament type situation? But also sometimes those tournaments can be kind of hit or miss in terms of what coaches are watching. Are they, the right coaches at the schools that I'm targeting? And that's kind of where something like Head First Showcases come into play, is giving that kind of targeted exposure to a list of schools that looks like the list of schools you're looking at,
right.
which is another thing that we can kind of touch on as well. But like as you're building a list of schools, it's not just I'm interested in these three schools. That's where you can start. But then what are the schools that also look like those three schools that have some qualities in common, and how are you getting exposure to them? So even if you had unlimited dollars, the exposure that you need to get, you don't have unlimited days in the calendar over the course
Yeah,
of the summer. And so
right.
that's where
Right.
you need to kind of be targeted and efficient. Um, one follow up that I have on this, Justin, that I'm curious for your take on is video as well. Like obviously it's you can't travel around the country following every coach that you want to play in front of all the time. So where do you see video kind of falling into that exposure as you continue start the conversation with these college coaches?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, video is obviously a critical component of it. I don't see video as much about exposure as I see that as like introductory information, right? I mean, you could technically put that under exposure because it's maybe allowing a coach to see who you are for the first time. But I take that as a little bit I take that different just because I think that's part of your resume. To me, from there, now you're trying to figure out how do they see you? How does the coach see you? Right. And a lot of times that's they want to see you in person. Sometimes now they'll offer off of video and information, but and usually resources that they have that they trust. But yeah, I think video is critical. And I would say one of the things that I really like to tell student athletes, high school student athletes, is just try to compile some really, like, if you're a position player getting really good at bats, try to compile strings of at bats together at the end of it, not the whole at bat, but just trying to compile real quick, short, concise, that if a coach grabs that and sees it, they can see a lot of stuff in a short amount of time. You're trying to be really efficient with that. And if you're a pitcher, it's even easier because it's easier to get that video and clip that up too. But I think having a that video piece, Max, is really critical up front. I just see that more as part of the resume. But yeah, I mean, you could argue that it's part of the exposure. I mean, it's exposure, but I think that's what leads to kind of the direction of where you need to get the exposure in person. But that's a really good question, man. I think it's a critical piece moving forward. And then we didn't touch on it yet, but like the social media aspect of that,
Yeah.
I am not one of those that believes that you're going to get offers off social media. I think that's the one out of 10,000. But it does help. I think it can draw some coaches to see you more, check out your video, they follow you, they see what you're putting up. But you want to be really careful on that too, that you're not coming across like if your team loses 10-1 and you post and you're all excited about your home run that night, just be really careful. Sometimes the coaches will dive into that. They'll try to figure out did they win or not. You're really trying to keep it very simple video, maybe once a week, once every couple of weeks that can be updated. You don't want to overdo that. You don't want to do it on simple things that you should be doing, like working out. It's like the coaches would think that you would be working out. I think you can overdo it a little bit on that side, Max. What do you think on that, Max?
So I think that's a really good point. So it's interesting. I was talking with Coach Woj from Yale the other day on the baseball side, and they're a program that uses social media really heavily in their recruiting, which was really interesting to hear. Because to me, it always seems as like this. You don't have to be on these platforms to be getting recruited or to put your stuff out there, but it can be additive.
Absolutely.
But they're a program that uses it really heavily, where they want kids to DM them and send them video and all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yep.
I think the most important thing when considering the video, the coach communication, the use of social media platforms, all of it. And Justin, you and I talked about this earlier today, but that authenticity piece, you need to be true to your own brand. Like you don't often think of yourself as having a quote unquote brand as a student athlete, but you really do. And what makes up that brand is all of those touch points that you have with the coaches that you're talking with. And it needs to be true to who you are as a player, as a person, as a human, as what you're looking for in a school, all that stuff. And I think that if you're pushing really aggressively on social media or pushing video out all the time, that's fine. It could help. It may not, depending on what the programs you're talking with are. But it is really important that everything that you're doing on that front resonate with who you truly are as a
Yes.
player,
Yeah.
as a
Yep.
teammate, as a
Yep.
person, so that it really kind of rings true in all those touch points.
Yeah, great stuff, man. And I'll let you go to the next question. I just want to add one quick thing. I do think it can be really useful, like Coach Wojcik said. Like coaches definitely see that. Most coaches are on social media. I mean, they understand that that's how they can see some players. I just don't think at a lot of places it's like I see this video on Twitter or Instagram and I love it, so I'm going to offer him. Like some people think that's how it goes. I think it
Yeah.
can be really beneficial from a following, kind of seeing the progress standpoint. I think it can be extremely beneficial. I mean, I would recommend players use it if they're comfortable with it and they know how to do it. For sure.
Yeah. Two questions have come in that I think are related, so I'm going to kind of wrap them into
Yeah, let's
one.
roll.
And they're
Yep,
around communication with college coaches in and around the head first setting, like before and then after a showcase. So part one is how far in advance of the showcase should an athlete communicate with a coach? What form should that communication take? And then on the back end, should we follow up after a head first showcase with emails right after the showcase? Should we wait a bit and see if coaches reach out to us to see if there is genuine interest? Like headed into an event like this, Justin, what would you advise student athletes do? Email touch points before, during, after. How do they kind of manage that as a thinking about the showcase, not just as the standalone 2 day thing that's the be all end all, but as a platform to in your recruiting as a waypoint along your recruiting journey.
yeah. So before you go, in my opinion, ideally you have either like number or something like that, the time that you're going to be playing at, what event you're in. Obviously you want to give them a date and a location so that they know where you're going to be. Sometimes that can be missing it, but I think an email, I try not to go earlier than 2 weeks before, because I think it can get lost and they can forget. I really like to do the week of, have the student athlete reach out to the coach with information on the location, kind of as a reminder where they're going to be, just a few notes on themselves, what their resume looks like, maybe a link to a YouTube video, really short and concise, academics obviously included in that, just some brief stuff, and reaching out and saying, hey coach, here's some information, I look forward to meeting you. And then now when you get to the event, I really like the player to go out of their way to make sure it's like, hey, I'm so and so, I sent you the email, I really, I'm excited to meet you, and have that conversation so that now they have the face to it right now, and then you go out and perform. And then after it's over, to me, Max, I like a follow up maybe a week later. That's kind of my timeline of like, send an email with the information, try to connect with them at the event, and then after that, then follow up. Now, one quick caveat here: not every event is created equal, and so you can't always speak with the coaches at an event. And so Headfirst is unique like that. So there are different, for example, different events where you could go and the coaches are outside. They're not paid to be there, right? And they're not helping with the event, and so they can't speak with you there. And so there are different rules around different camps, and it depends on your grad year and all that too. So it depends on it. I guess in regards to a camp like Headfirst, that's the protocol that I would take.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that the coming out of a head first event, yes, if you go out there and you play well for 2 days, you're probably going to get some emails or texts or
For
whatever from
sure.
college coaches
Yep.
in the fall from the event. But that doesn't mean I think that I would still encourage student athletes to be proactive in their communication because I think that from a mindset perspective, the most important piece of the recruiting process is to engage with it proactively. Don't think of yourself as a passenger in your recruiting car. You got to be driving that car.
Yep.
And a key piece of that is kind of setting the agenda and the timeline for some of these communications with obvious, you got to be kind of sensitive to what coaches have going on as well.
Yeah.
Like one thing, yes, you certainly want to email coaches in the week or two ahead of camp and, make sure they have the video you have, your test scores, your transcript, wherever you are in the conversation with them, but also understanding that in the middle of June, July, August, they could be super busy. So if you don't hear back within 48 hours, that's not like the end of the world. It's not that they're not interested necessarily. It's they have a lot going on. They're going from this showcase to this tournament to this other camp. They're hosting, recruits on their own campus. They're running their own prospect camps. So understand that being proactive and persistent in the communication, but also understanding and allowing for the reality of the coach's
Right.
schedule over the summer
Right.
too.
Great point. Yeah. And you don't want to be overzealous. You don't want to send 3, 4 emails with a week after looking for a response. I mean, that can come off a little wrong too. So you want to have some feel there. The one thing I would say too, Max, hitting on it, which you brought up a good point. Many coaches that I talk to and know really well, they go through a process of going to a lot of games and events, and they compile kind of their list of their top players, right? And from that, then they start reaching out. And so it's not always, an event and then now they're reaching out to maybe their 5 favorite players. A lot of times they might combine that with some other events and start seeing how they stack up compared to other players that they've seen across the summer, right? Early fall. And then they get to a point where they reach out. So if, like you said, if you're a player and you haven't heard from a school for a couple of weeks, it absolutely does not mean they are not interested. A lot of times in that, it's either time constraints, they're doing other things, they're busy, but it's also how they're probably figuring out how you stack up compared to other players in your class. And so they're kind of putting it off a little bit to get a better gauge on where you stack up for them in their process.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um,
Great
Another
question.
question, yeah, some really good questions
That's
around
a good
kind of
question.
coach communication as well. And so in that vein, Justin, I'm endlessly curious for your take. What is the best way to communicate with a college coach? I mean, so far we've talked a lot about email. So again, I think kind of a two-parter. What is the best way to communicate with a college coach? And if it's an email, what's the best way to kind of go about writing that email, like a cold email to a college coach? How do you
Yeah.
start that?
Yeah, so we're talking about different levels here now, right? There's different ways that I would advise players differently. So you have to remember that September 1st of the junior year for baseball and softball is contact at that point where they can communicate with the player. So, I mean, if you're a freshman in high school and you send an email to a coach, don't expect a response. They can't legally respond, right? So you kind of have to know where that is, and each level is different. So D3 is much more open, but they're not going to they're not starting the recruiting process, typically until summer after your junior year, maybe into your junior year a little bit, but they're not jumping on people, players too early either, student athletes too early. So, anyways, in general, I guess when you talk about the communication with coaches, though, um, I actually think it's a little different from each level. I do recommend, like, as you go up levels, so like the Division 1 level, for example. I don't think email is fantastic because they just get so many of them, both baseball and softball. There's just so many players reaching out. And obviously, the higher up you go, the more in demand those schools can be, right? And so, however, if you're going to do that, I think it's a good starting point to reach out to a school. And I like to reach out to figure out who the recruiting coordinator is. So a lot of players will try to find the head coach's information and they email the head coach. That's much less likely to get a response. They're just too busy, and it's more difficult. Now, at the Division 3 level, I would say go ahead and email the head coach, and that's fine. I think you can, a lot of times get in touch with them that way. But as you climb up, I like to get the recruiting coordinator's information for a player. Then the player reaches out. And then from there, I try to keep it simple, Max. I think you want a really short email. I think you want it short and sweet. Height, weight, position, link to a video. I prefer like a YouTube link so there's no file sharing issues, right? Which can come to be a problem. And then the academic information. So whether it's transcript, maybe a quick GPA, ACT, SAT, whatever, if you have one of those scores, just keeping it really, really quick, but personalized and authentic. So you writing it your style, maybe a brief sentence on why you're interested in that specific school. So it's not this copy and paste, something specific maybe about the staff, or hey, nice, nice series win last weekend. Good, great to see you guys win that series. Whatever it is to pull that together, Max. I mean, but I'm just trying to keep that short and sweet with the information that I know that they're going to want, and I really try to get players to just avoid, I don't want to say lengthy and rambling or anything like that, because it could be really good information. But to grab their eyes and get their attention, I think it needs to be really quick. And then from there, once they get, that dialogue starts, now you can get into more information about yourself, what else you're maybe doing off the field, some things that are probably really important to them. But up front, they just kind of want to know that basic information that I think is critical.
Yeah, I 1000% agree. And the couple things that I would kind of like double click on or add in is that personalization factor is so key. I
Mhm.
mean, and for me, that's not just a matter of like, yeah, you definitely want to make sure that you have the coach's name right, the name of the school
Right.
right. If you're putting in their
Right.
mascot, like
The
make
old
sure
stuff.
that all those that that you cross your T's and dot your I's on that front for
Yeah.
sure. But also personalize it, in a sense of why is this school why does this school appeal to me, right? Like if you're writing an email to the Caltech coaching staff and you're like, I'm excited to major in English, okay, that doesn't necessarily align with Caltech's
There we
academic
go.
programs,
Yep.
right? But
Yep.
if you're emailing Babson and you're like, I'm super interested in the entrepreneurship program that Babson offers, great. That's a really good reason to be interested in that school.
Yep.
There's some that will be baseball or softball related. There's plenty that can be academic related. There's geography basis for them. So don't, you want to go beyond just getting everything technically right and like, well, this email is going to Justin Musil and it's the right school and it's my name and all those things. It's also why I'm interested in this program because that just signals a level of interest to the coach as well.
Yep.
And then the other
Great.
thing
Great
that I
stuff.
would kind of point on and point out and extend is as you start these conversations, as you alluded to, Justin, they could shift context, right? It might start with an email, then you're going to meet them in person at
Yeah,
a
right,
showcase.
right. Yep.
And then to some degree, it's going to be kind of driven by what their preferences are. There are some coaches who are going to want to keep handling it over email. There's some who are going to send you a DM on Twitter. There's some that are going to say, hey, I want to talk to you on the phone or send you a text or whatever. And so I think that having that info ready and being able to accommodate how they are best able to communicate is a really key piece. Like part of it is certainly how you best communicate yourself as a student athlete, but also you got to be kind of willing to adjust and say, oh, this coach wants to have a phone call with me. Great. Seems like I'm going to get some good reps getting on a phone call that in 2024 you don't get too many of anymore.
That is so good, Max, and I'm glad that we're tag teaming this, because that's one of the key points of all that. When you talk about coach communication, you have to be versatile. It might be a phone call, and you have to be really good on the phone. Like you have to be, you have to have like, from a social skills standpoint, they're kind of trying to figure out, what how you operate, what your interests are, right? I mean, so I think that's really important. It might be text. I think text is that's extremely common, right? That they're reaching out via text. But ultimately they're going to try to get to phone calls, because that's where they can speak with the player, and that is really how you get to know someone right at that point. And I'll say this in regards to coach communication: once you get to the calls, you're in a good spot with that coach. Like there is enough interest there for them to be investing that time on a call. A
Yeah.
quick email back, a quick message back, that's all great. That can be really positive. But once they get to actually talking with you on the phone and multiple times, now I consider you a recruit of that school. That to me, that's when you kind of shift over to where they're investing time on you, and they're not doing that with 1,000 players.
No, certainly not. I mean, that like, I think that's another really good point is like, as they shift you from different, if a
Yep.
coach says,
Yep.
hey, I want to move
Yep.
you from email, I want to start texting you, give me your cell phone number. Great. That's a really
Yes.
good
Yeah.
sign. Even if you're going to have to get more comfortable with texting or calling or whatever it is, that's a
Yep.
really good sign. Like all these things
Absolutely.
moving kind of farther down the recruiting funnel.
Yeah. Yep.
Um,
Great stuff, man.
One a question that came in, which I'm going to kind of generalize because this is more specific to like for a left-handed pitcher. But could you talk a little bit about the role of objective measurements? Like, are there if you're a pitcher, it's velo, it's spin rate, it's vertical break. For a hitter, it's exit velo, it's 60 time. Like when you're talking with coaches, with players, advising them through the process, like what role do objective measurements, do these numbers that stand out in literal black and white in an email or on some kind of perfect game profile, whatever it is, what's the role of those in assessing a player and as a part of the recruiting process?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. I mean, it's a large percentage of the first step. I mean, if an individual, if a high school student athlete does not have the measurables that they need, it's probably not going anywhere. And so, the natural components, sometimes I hear like, well, he's just a ball player. She's just a ball player. I know, she doesn't run well or he doesn't run well, but she's just a ball player, and there is some context to that, and there are other measurables with it. So then it's like, well, then you better really hit, and what measurables do we have to prove that, right? But there's no mistaking. I mean, we're talking, recruiting here, but I mean, we're talking pro too. Like this is the basis, this is the foundation. And so one of the things I tell people a lot, Max, is we can control some of that, right? We can develop as individual players and really improve those measurables, right? Whether it's exit velo, whether it's velocity in general, whether it's softball or baseball. I mean, obviously, the velocity is what they're looking for, right? Spin rates obviously are really huge right now, the analytic piece of it, but they're absolutely critical. And if you don't have the measurables, it's uh, you have to perform at such a high level for a long time, but you're still going to be overlooked a little bit because those measurables are a key predictor in future success. And they're always going to fall on the sword of the highly talented, skilled, extremely impressive measurables over the really high performer. Ideally, you're getting both, right? You want to have both, but I've seen it to where kids are actually not performing at the highest level, but they have tons of offers because of what they can be, right? And those are kind of the lottery tickets, right, Max? I mean, and at that level, it's at college level. I mean, they're looking to win championships. They're looking to do big things, and if they can hit on a lottery ticket, I mean, they're going to take it. So, I mean, they're absolutely critical.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think that's they have become more and more important. In
Yeah,
my time working for Head First, it started out and there was a 60 and there was a home to first and there was
yeah,
a home to home, but like it's
right.
now increased in importance so
Yeah,
much. And
yeah,
one of the really interesting things that in talking with college coaches, one conversation, well, two different conversations really stand out. One is how different, or kind of about how differently college programs might treat some things, where some of them will say outright to me, to players, to other coaches, they'll say, I am only looking at hitters who pop an exit velo above 90 and who run a sub 760. And that's what fits in
yeah,
my program. And you have to hit, but even my first base, even my catcher, they're all running sub 760s because that objective measurement is the first filter in their recruiting process. In other programs, they're like, yeah, it's an indicator of what I think this kid's peak output can be, but it's not the be all end all. It's not what I'm making the first line of recruiting decisions based on. I want to see if she's throwing 67 or whatever, I want to see how that reads in a game, or I want to see what that home to first time looks like in a
yeah,
game. Is she straight line fast? Is she game fast? Is she making contact? Because things like exit velo, especially, and this is kind of the other conversation that I've had in this vein, and this was with the old Yale recruiting coordinator who is now in the pro game, but he was saying that like the objective measurements are like the peak horsepower, right? They're the max output that you can do in a controlled setting, whereas things like gameplay or your high school stats or travel ball stats, those are more kind of the GPA. So it's like the standardized test score GPA comparison between these two things. Standardized test score is the best that you can do while you're sitting in a gymnasium, in a high school gymnasium for 3 hours at a time. GPA is the day in, day out work. Objective measurements are the peak output that you can put out there. And in this context, your how you play in a game is more that kind of day in, day out in-game performance. And so that was kind of an
right.
interesting analogy that he built between those two things as well. But it's just so fascinating to me to see how differently these programs use the same data. Some of them, we hand out objective measurements at every camp and we send them to coaches. We hand them out in paper form. We email them to them right after day one. And some coaches go through that immediately and they're highlighting all the players that have the right metrics. And some may look at it, but only if they see a kid, perform really well in the game later that afternoon, or if they have a good conversation, and then they'll look at the 60 time and say, oh, you know what? That kid is really fast. And so it's just so interesting to me how differently different programs use this stuff too.
Yeah, and I think like all of them are using it. I mean, I can't think of an example of how this isn't valuable for a program. I mean, I think the extent of it, I think as you climb up in levels, it becomes much more important. You can no longer be. It's really difficult to be a one trick pony per se, like where you can do one thing really well. I mean, that's really where the measurables can help, where you can kind of understand the big picture of a player a lot better, in my opinion. Great
Absolutely.
stuff, though. Awesome question.
Um, One kind of tactical that Justin, just to talk through the timeline. So we talked about when student athletes should start to reach out to college coaches around their showcase performance. You kind of alluded to these rules from the NCAA. When can college coaches start reaching out to players? Like, what do those conversations look like based on, I know some, recent, some less recent kind of updates, especially on the baseball side around phone call loopholes and all that sort of stuff. So what are those rules? Just like kind of quick and easy.
Yeah, it's become really black and white with in regards to Division One. I mean, it's September 1, and there used to be some workarounds, right? With might be a club coach, a high school coach, like an advisor, like I was, and then you have the player call because the player had the access to call whenever they wanted. They've shut all that down. That is no longer the case. They're trying to slow the processes down. So I mean, really, the things that you're trying to do before that, when you talk about timeline, Max, going back to that, you're trying to set yourself up so that September 1 of your junior year, you're already on list. They want to call you. That part has already happened. You don't wait until that time and then start doing things like going to head first, playing maybe some travel ball, whatever it is. You're trying to set yourself up so that at that time they can reach out. And now when you work down in levels, there's more access. So now we remove some restrictions. Division 2, it's much earlier, and then Division 3 has really not a lot of restrictions at all. So it does depend on the level. But when we talk about Division 1, it is very very black and white now as far as when they can reach out. And there aren't really any workarounds anymore. It is straight up. So which I kind of go back and forth on it. I'd prefer it to be a year earlier. I think it would just make it more of a marathon, not a sprint. But I also agree that it shouldn't be, seventh graders committing either, and they don't, they have no idea where they want to be and what they want to do and all that. So I think eventually, just my prediction, I think they'll end up moving that 1 year earlier.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. The elimination of that phone call loophole was something that like makes a lot of sense. It didn't make
Yeah.
it necessarily
Like,
make a
what's
lot
the
of sense that
point?
it ever existed, but
Yeah. What's the point then? Yeah. I
um,
mean, yeah.
and but the other thing that I think is kind of a natural regulator on the timeline is when we're talking about like the schools that attend a Head First Showcase tend to be there's something like 125 schools in the country that have sub 20% admissions rate. They're super competitive from an admissions standpoint at those sorts of schools. And it's not universal. It's not the same across the board. Stanford's recruiting is very different than, UC Davis is very different than
Yes.
Columbia, right? They're all very different from each other. But generally speaking, at a lot of these kind of high academic schools, a lot of these schools that have this competitive admissions process, especially in the kind of the lower levels of baseball and softball at D1, and then certainly across the D3 range, they have to wait a little bit longer anyway, just
Yes.
because they need to have a more robust academic profile. If
Right.
you're, Brian Ham at Yale and you really want to recruit this eighth grader because, he's throwing 92, that's all well and good. But if you walk across campus to admissions within, a middle school transcript, that conversation isn't going to progress very far with your admissions team, just because they need, they have no way of knowing yet, is this a kid who we can accept at Yale? Is this the sort of kid who we want you moving forward with the recruiting from an admissions standpoint? And so there is kind of that natural regulation from an academic standpoint, typically at the sorts of schools that recruit at a head first by and large. Not universal, but
Yep.
kind of generally speaking.
Yeah, they're just going to move slower in the process in general. I mean, they because slots are a lot different too. We're in a time where if schools make a mistake on a player, after a year they can easily say, hey, it's just not working out. At a lot of the schools that had first, that's just not how they're going to operate. That they're not able to do that. And so they do have I guess they all have I believe they all have a responsibility to get it right. I just think that a lot of the higher academic schools are really held accountable for the decisions of an offer versus some other schools that it's a little bit more transactional, which is just
Yeah,
part of I'm not blaming the coaches. It's just kind of part of the game as it is right now with transfers
it's kind of just
and
part of the reality of the landscape.
right, right, yep,
Um, so kind of in keeping with that, a question that we get all the time is kind of how open should a player be with a college coach about what they're looking for? We're talking about kind of assessing this two-way fit. And personally, I think that it's generally speaking not a bad thing that a lot of these schools move a little bit slower because it gives student athletes time to assess what it is they're looking for in the process. So, Justin, you're talking with a player. How open should they be with a coach about what they want, if this school is the right fit for them, what they're looking for in a college experience? Like, how do you talk them through that?
yeah. I mean, there's two things that you're trying to do here. The first thing is you're really trying to be authentic in what you're looking for and who you are, right? What your interests are, where you want to be, and all that. But I do so there's that, and I also think it's really good to kind of have continuing conversations, and so I call it like open minded. So you have the first one to be authentic, make sure they know who you are, what you're wanting, but then also on the second piece of that, those two, be open minded, because I've had so many situations where a kid will say, I'm not interested in there. But they don't really know about it. They don't know about the staff. They don't know about the location or the city it's in. They don't know anything about the school. And so that's really a time where you don't want to shut it off. And that's my point, Max. You want to be authentic and real, but you also don't want to point out so many things that you don't like about that school or the reasons you wouldn't go there, so that it cuts it off so you can't learn more about it. So you just want to be really careful of that balance. Definitely authentic, be upfront about what you want. If it's a school in Florida, for example, and you will never go to Florida, you have no interest, you don't like it, there is no reason in pretending that you're going to do that. I would still encourage a player to hear them out, like learn more about the school. It doesn't hurt you. Learn more about the city it's in. But at some point, yeah, you want to be honest and just say, hey, that's not of interest to me. Thank you. Or academically doesn't match up for what I'm looking for, no problem. But I do think there's those two. Be authentic and be real and let them know what you want, but also be open minded. So you're trying to balance that and not cut it off too quick.
I love that. I think that like the balance of those two things
Yeah.
is A, absolutely crucial, but also B, pretty tough, I think, sometimes for
Yeah.
a 15, 16, 17-year-old to kind of
Very
engage
tough.
with.
Yep.
And one of the things that I talk a lot with student athletes about and with families about is as a way to do that, one of the things that I often think about is what are the qualities of the school rather than the name of the school. If you separate the qualities of the school from the name of the school, how does that line up? If a college coach reaches out to you and says, I'm really interested in you, I want you to come to my school. If the first thing you think is, well, I'm not interested in going to Grinnell, that's totally different than the reality. You're like, I'm not going to Grinnell because I'm only interested in NESCAC schools. Well, it turns
Right.
out that Grinnell and a NESCAC school
Yeah.
have a lot in common.
Yes.
One of them, they
Yes.
just transplanted the campus into Iowa instead of being in New England. But like, they have a lot in common from an academic standpoint, from a setting standpoint, from the size of the student body, from a lifestyle. All these things do kind of line up.
Right.
So think about the qualities of the school. And I think that's kind of a way that I talk through keeping that open mind. It's not, no, I'm not interested in that program. It's, oh, I got to learn a little bit about that program and see, I'm looking for a school that's 4 to 6,000. It's close to a city, but not in a city. And, I'm looking to major in X. Does it check these boxes? How does it line up against these things? If it does, then I need to kind of maybe continue that conversation. Even if my initial reaction was, oh, I'm not interested in that school. I am interested in these qualities. So it seems like I need to kind of keep an open mind, like you said, and learn more about this program.
Yeah, that's really good. And I have, and we can maybe send this to everyone on, but I have 7 keys to find the right fit. And I think if you go through those 7, I think you get to a pretty good point pretty quick on, where it's at. But it keeps you open because a lot of them you don't know about until you dive into it more, right? So that's something that Max we can talk about off the webinar too, just to
Yeah,
maybe pass along that information as well.
absolutely. One follow up on the video that just came in, Justin, is so my player takes video of their workouts as well as their games. Is the video of the workouts of, kind of practice reps, is that worth sharing with the coach, or are coaches only interested in, predominantly interested in game clips that they're looking for?
Yeah, awesome question. Appreciate the question. No, both. I think you're trying to find a really nice balance with both. Sometimes it's actually even more valuable to have a really good round of batting practice, or a bullpen, some defensive stuff, right? It's kind of hard if you're an infielder in game. I mean, how much video do you have to get a few clips, right? So that's where you can maybe get 5 to 10 reps in a row that you can add on there. I like to do the game reps first, and then I moved to the practice reps, or the reps that you're getting away from the fielding game. I think both are really critical. So yeah, both are really good.
Yeah,
In
I've
fact, sometimes
certainly heard.
Max, sorry, let me just finish on that. Sometimes if it's updated, let's just say a player goes, you get rained out a couple games in a week, and you've gone 10 days without a game or something like that. That's a great time to just add more video. That might just be a round of BP. I mean, those are critical. So you're just trying to get enough video as it goes along to that, where they can really evaluate you. So I think those are critical.
Yeah, and I think that the key two pieces about that I would kind of add on, like, or kind of subsidize as well, is A, you can get angles that show mechanics that you can't get in game, because mom and dad should not be out, in the middle of
Yeah.
the infield during a live gameplay, right? Like, let's not do that. But you're able to get some of those, more kind of focused angles, and as
Right.
a way to really show mechanics, especially on something like BP, getting those angles, or if you're throwing a bullpen, getting those angles to show coaches your mechanics is really crucial. And then also to force a certain mechanic, right? If you could, as you said, you could play 4 games in a row and not get a specific backhand that you're working through in this in the
Right.
right
Yeah.
way at shortstop, but you
Yep.
can do that really easily with a practice rep to show that. And so if you want to kind of show a specific skill set and to capture those angles that really demonstrate mechanics, I think that that practice video is a huge important addition to the in-game footage as well. Coaches
Agreed.
do obviously also want to see that in-game footage because
Yep.
it's against live competition, right? And that's
Yep.
that's a key piece of their assessment too.
Yep. It's both. Yep. Great
I know
question.
we're right up against 9:15, but with the risk of going a little bit over, I would love to uh, ask one more question. And I think that this is probably the question that we get most often, or it's the question that informs the other kinds of questions that we get. So, Justin, I'm a sophomore, junior, whatever, freshman, going through starting my recruiting process. How do I find out, where do I fit in this ladder hierarchy of college baseball or softball? I think I'm a pretty good player. My parents think I'm pretty good. My coach thinks I'm pretty good. I started my high school team. Where do I go from here? How do I start to set my sights on, from a baseball or softball perspective? Where do I target? How do I assess where I fit into this landscape?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and one I get a lot too. It really starts with a couple of things. I mean, your first thing, and Scott Laverty and I talked about this, Chapman head coach on one of our podcasts on the recruiting roadmap, but it still starts with your ability. Like even at really good schools, it really starts with your ability, and then from there it's your academic profile, obviously. So the first thing that I would say is to get an idea of how you fit in, what you should be shooting for, what you're interested in. I guess that's up to you as far as what you're interested in, but you have to understand what is attainable too, right? And that's what we're getting at, Max. And so I like individuals, so student athletes, to have people around them that they really trust that can give them a credible evaluation. Here's the key though. I think it's 3 of them, and it has to be people who are extremely credible. So one simple thing is like head first. If you have three coaches giving you the same sort of feedback about your strengths and weaknesses or whatever it is, right? Or more, that is a really good indication of what they're seeing that you need to work on, right? And that might be a kind of a hold up for you if you have certain weaknesses that are, you know, pretty apparent that you need to develop. But Max, it starts with the evaluation side, really. Softball or baseball, you have to know where you're fitting in with that. And if you don't know that, and you don't have a lot of people around you that you feel comfortable with that can give you that, I think that's when you get into the process and you maybe do attend, a head first. And if it's not a head first, then it's, and also maybe like a prospect camp where you can really get some really good feedback from a college coach. Now, once I've gotten some feedback from maybe the coaches at head first, and then maybe I go over to this prospect camp, okay, I have a pretty good idea of where I'm fitting in. And if it's at a Division III school and they say, hey, we really like you, but you need to work on this and this and this. Well, if that's at Kobe, you're probably not wanting to go to Duke and go to their camp because now you're ready for Duke. Like, to me, you kind of have to figure out where you're fitting in and all that, but it starts with the evaluation, which is extremely complex. This is a 2-hour conversation, Max, because a lot of people just don't know where to go, bud. Like,
Yeah.
they don't know
Yeah.
who to seek out for that evaluation. I actually think one of the biggest problems in the process is poor evaluating. So people who maybe don't know the whole landscape, they're really good in their area, but they don't see players outside of that area. That can happen, and I don't mean any disrespect by that, but I've seen so many players that have given me evaluations or told me kind of where they think they're at, and they're really off base. In fact, I'll give you a quick example. I just brought up Michael Bush, who's playing for the Cubs right now. When I first met with them, they had no idea how good he was. They had no idea, right? And the first time I saw him, I was like, this is the best high school player I've seen, right? And it was early in my career, but um, and they just had no idea, Max. Like, they
Yeah.
were just dumbfounded by me saying like where do you want to go? Like, this is up to you. And so they had been told, though, by a hitting coach, which I totally respect, but that, he probably needed to stay local, and there were some other things with that. And it really misinformed him, I guess, is the point, where him and his parents just thought that that was the route that he should. I mean, he's probably gonna have to stay in state, go to the University of Minnesota, which is fine. But like, he didn't think he was anything outside of that, right? So you just have to be really careful, and that's why I like to have a few different ones, because it's, not everybody's right on it either, Max. So,
Yeah.
but it starts with the evaluation, and I think this is a lengthier conversation, but I'm trying to summarize it as quick as I can.
Yeah, no, as you were talking, I was like, there's 18 things that I that we
Right.
should talk about
This is
here
our
too.
this is a separate
Because
webinar in
I mean,
itself.
oh, absolutely. And one thing that I think, and you kind of alluded to this as well, but like, if you're getting some of those evaluations from people that are close to you, if it's a coach, if it's somebody who's kind of within, if it's an instructor or a personal
Yep.
trainer or whatever, it it needs to be someone credible, as you said. It also, I think, needs to be someone who loves you enough and cares about you enough to
Yeah.
be able to
Yeah.
tell you no, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Right.
because you can go like my high school coach, God love him, he hadn't watched college baseball in probably
Yep.
15, 20 years. So he's like, I'd talk to any coach for you, any D1 coach. And I'm like, okay,
Right.
that's fine, but like that's not
Right.
really gonna like that's not level setting
That's so good.
realistically against where I project
Yes.
as a player. So it
Yes.
needs to be
Yep.
someone who cares about you enough to tell you no and where you fit in and also give you that feedback. The other thing that I think is sometimes potentially a shortcoming for some coaches who have the absolute best of intentions and are doing so many great things in their programs, but when is the last time they watched all the different levels of college
Right.
baseball
Right.
to get a sense of where some of the kids in their program might fit? If you're only watching the SEC network, then you're seeing a very different type of baseball than if you're popping in to go see Yale and Harvard this weekend in New
Yeah.
Haven, or going to watch a NESCAC doubleheader out in Western Mass or something like that. And so having somebody who's experienced as an evaluator, is a credible source, cares enough about you to be able to tell you what the limits are, but then also has a sense of the landscape and is able to kind of point you towards these are both D3 schools, but they're very different than each other.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned Scott, you mentioned Lab at Chapman. Like, okay, they're a D3 program. They won a national championship a few years ago, and they had two pitchers in their rotation throwing 95 and 96, from what I understand. You can't tell me that's like, oh no, those are, he's a D3 guy. He only throws 96. Like that's a very different type of program and
Yep.
rotation and skill set than schools that are just down the road from there as
Yep.
well. And so being able to assess the different levels of the college game across baseball and softball is also just a really crucial piece of that.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And we had touched on this earlier, but I'll hit on this really quick again. There are levels within each level too, right? We talked about Division One, but like Division Two has the same thing, Division Three has the same thing. The best of the best at the Division Three level is very different than the worst teams in the country at the Division Three level. Those are two those are just different levels, right? Within the Division Three level. And like you said, at the SEC, like a Power Five, even SEC compared to anything, right? I mean, not that they're necessarily better than in Oregon State, right? And East Carolina, which is a mid-major. I mean, those teams can be really great too. But in general, that conference is just really, I mean, totally separate almost from the different levels. But you just have to understand that too. So I think people throw things around too much, Max, where it's like, this is a Division One player. It's like, ooh, what does that even mean? What do you mean by that? Like low level Division One, mid level, high level?
Yeah.
There's and then we haven't really touched on this, but there's the mental makeup side of it too, right? I mean, there's a lot to handle in college sports, right? So whether it's college softball or college baseball. So to me, I also like to understand what the player wants in that experience, right? And I've had players that have had Division One offers that have picked Division 3 schools, might be academic, but it's also because of the style of play. So it's like, look, I don't want this to be my life. I want to be
Yeah.
able to study abroad or something. Like there are different things that individuals have that you have to take a look at and say what is the best fit for this individual and not necessarily try to label them really quick. But I mean, ultimately though, it all starts with the eval max, as we know.
Yeah. I think that's also such a good point to tie it into the kind of that holistic experience. What are you looking for in the college experience? A piece of the college experience might be being in the dugout of a baseball or softball field. A
Yep.
huge part of it has to be the part in the classroom. It's the
Yep.
social aspect.
Yep.
It's the other things that you're looking to get and how do all these things fit together. And it goes back to, that conversation earlier we were having about assessing school fit and kind of being authentic, being true to what you are looking for as a whole experience at the next level.
Exactly. Yeah. Great questions tonight. Really good
Yeah,
stuff. We could
fantastic.
go
And
forever,
I,
Max.
I think we might need to have a part two at some point.
We should.
Um, and
We
I
should.
I know that we're a few minutes over, so thank you all for bearing with us. I think now is a good time to wrap up. I will say any follow-up questions from this or anything else that comes to mind, feel free to reach out to us at Headfirst, showcase at headfirstcamps.com, give us a call, shoot us an email, and we're certainly happy to talk through these more pieces of this. And thank you all for attending. It was awesome of you to take a little chunk out of your Thursday evening and stay tuned for the next few pieces of the recruiting roadmaps for some more info on how to prep for camp, where you are in the recruiting process, and all that. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at a session this summer.
Thanks, Max. Good being on.